Good morning, everyone. I hope you enjoyed Carl's presentation. I think he hit on a lot of the highlights that I myself was going to mention in my comments. But so I'd like to thank him for setting the scene for our panel, which is going to deal with transatlantic issues and the future of the West. Carl mentioned a number of the issues, and I'd like to just repeat them quickly here. The Transatlantic Alliance has been rocked by a number of challenges over the past few years. If you look at the last 4 or 5 years, the economic turmoil that took place in Europe, and particularly we saw that in the situation with Greece and the relationship with the EU. We've had the issue of migration because of the conflict in Syria, large inflows of migrants into Turkey and into Europe. In addition, you've had the conflict in Ukraine. The Russian invasion of Ukraine has put into question the democratic values of sustaining democracy in Europe. It's also raised the issues of the post-Cold War peace system in Europe. In addition, the issues of NATO solidarity, the role of NATO, whether NATO should continue to expand, what the role of NATO is. Furthermore, what is the issue in terms of cybersecurity that Carl mentioned that has taken place? As you heard throughout the campaign here in the United States, the Russian role in hacking, et cetera. So there are a lot of issues that are taking place in the transatlantic environment, those that touch particularly upon Europe, but also on the relationship between the United States and Europe. And there are two countries that are key to what may transpire in the next few years, and how the United States responds to those challenges these countries face is going to be key to our security as well as European security. And the two countries are Russia and Turkey to a great extent. Russia, why do I say Russia? Well, Russia is involved in a conflict in Ukraine. Its invasion of Ukraine, as I mentioned, has undermined the peace and stability of Europe and put into question a lot of the fundamental values of Europe, particularly our role in expanding democracy, our role in terms of the NATO alliance. Russia's role is also going to be important in terms of the issue of terrorism throughout Europe, fighting ISIS in the Middle East. Russia's role in Syria is expanding the flow of migrants, or at least not stemming the flow of migrants, and that touches upon European security. So the relationship with Russia is going to be very key on that. Another country that's going to be very key in terms of the future of transatlantic relations is Turkey. Turkey's role in terms of fighting the terrorist role in the Middle East, Turkey's role in terms of migration, Turkey's role with the EU. As you understand, Turkey wants to become a member of the EU, so this raises the issue of the EU expansion role. So these two countries are very key, and I'm glad to see that we have 3 top experts here in town that can shed some light on some of the issues that these countries and the Transatlantic Alliance now pose for the United States. Joining us this morning are Steve Sestanovich. Steve is a senior fellow, the Kennan fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. He brings many years of expertise in following Russian developments and also a government experience. Steve will be addressing the internal dynamics of Russia in terms of what makes Putin and the Russians tick in terms of their policies that we see emanating out of Moscow now. Also joining us is Angela Stent. Angela is the head of the Eurasian as well as Russian and East European Studies Center at Georgetown University, and she brings many years of government experience as well as research analysis to the table. She'll be looking at the foreign policy dynamics of the Russian role in terms of Russia's influences or attempts at influencing the West, and how this will impact the U.S.-Russian relationship as well as the U.S.-European relationship. Rounding out our panel is Ömer Taşpinar, who is a professor at National Defense University here in town. So these are our 3 experts. We're delighted that they can join us this morning. What we will do is have each of the panelists present their comments for about 10 minutes apiece. Afterwards, I'd like to open the floor to questions from the audience. With that, Steve, I'd like to turn to you, okay?
Thanks. Do you want me to speak?
No, you're my speaker.
Okay. Thank you very much, Roman.
Roman and I were colleagues at the White House 30 years ago. And
we're old friends.
We were so young then. And, right, as the Bob Dylan song says, I'm younger than that now. Look, we often talk about Russia and its impact on the Transatlantic alliance as though it were just this external force, and we have to think about, what our domestic tasks are. I thought it might be useful to kind of come at the Russia problem from the inside out, because after all, throughout the transatlantic world, we are seeing foreign policy and international arrangements being undone by domestic politics. Well, how's that look from the Russian point of view? What's the bottom-up, inside-out perspective that Putin would have? And what's on his plate as he tries to work out this interaction with us, which Angela is going to explain and I'm not? I want to look quickly at several elements of his domestic agenda and his sort of strategic preoccupations. First, the economy. Second, a problem that I'll call political legitimacy. Third, electoral politics. Fourth, factional politics. And then just a brief segue that will be my handoff to Angela. On the economy, this is where Putin has perhaps done worst. He has seen Russian GDP, which dropped more sharply in the Great Recession than any other G20 economy. He's seen growth slow since that time, and since 2014, Russia has been in recession. It has, in 2015, had a very big drop, and this year a small drop, and there's a forecast that growth will resume next year, but there was a forecast last year that growth would resume this year, so don't take this one to the bank. To put this another way, Russia is entering the third year of recession. A couple of macro indicators to go beyond that picture of economic distress. Foreign direct investment has dropped 95% in 3 years. That is a big, big number. You have seen real income this year drop 7%. And you still have considerable inflation. Russia's reserve funds that were set up in the past decade for a rainy day are going to be exhausted next year. That doesn't mean all foreign exchange, but those are two big funds. They were kind of in the neighborhood of several $100 billion. They'll be gone. More worrying for Putin, there is the question of what individual Russians and Russian families experience. You have had real pressure on the middle class in the course of this crisis. There's an interesting poll a little while ago that asked people whether they considered themselves middle class. 3 years ago, the answer was 44% of Russians thought they were middle class. Now the number is 21. So you have a real loss of status. Automobile sales, real middle class indicator, right? Down 50% this year. These are bad numbers. And they're not the good numbers that you would want in an election year. They have been a source, made people wonder whether what you would have in a normal country, which is throw the rascals out, would happen under Putin. Putin addressed this question in his yearly call-in show late last spring. And you had an interesting change of rhetoric from him. You know, questioners said, well, what about foreign policy? And he said, you know, foreign policy is not the big thing. We've got to worry about solving problems that face ordinary people every day. He's made himself the man of the people. Even more, he has taken a stance against a big problem that I'm sure his focus groups told him is on the minds of ordinary Russians, and that is abuse of power. Putin is the person saying the Russian system screws ordinary people. You don't hear that too often in our press coverage, but that is how Putin has positioned himself. He says you have to win the people's trust. Now, how has that played out in electoral terms for him? The short answer, you know, which I have to admit disappoints me, is it's been a big success. Putin he had parliamentary elections this year, and he faces presidential elections year after next, although there's a Moscow rumor mill story that has it that he will move those up. In approaching the parliamentary elections, he faced the problem, a series of problems. His party is unpopular. It's called the Party of Crooks and Thieves for a reason, and it's a name that sticks. He's popular, his party isn't. Second, he wasn't on the ballot. When Putin is on the ballot, he wins. When his party doesn't have him on the ballot, it's an issue. And he remembered, of course, as everybody did, that the response to the last parliamentary election was this burst of protests that engulfed the country and made people think the regime might really have to refashion itself in some way. I mean, I was on panel discussions across Washington in the year that was happening, and people were saying the Putin regime might not survive. I didn't say that, but you know, but a lot of foolish commentators did. And what happened? Putin scored a tremendous victory with his party. They've got a bigger majority than ever. There are no liberal oppositionists in the parliament, and there was no protest. You know, Putin took a risk appointing a liberal outsider to run the Central Election Commission in place of his old buddy, a guy as crooked as you could imagine, who had manipulated the elections in the past. He got rid of him, and brought in this woman who said, they should fear me. And that bet paid off great for him, because she provided a kind of surface legitimacy for the process, said there were little irregularities, the way we always say when there have been big irregularities, but there weren't really. And this was, I won't say a victory won fair and square, because there were many, many problems with it, but he did okay. Since then, you've had a shift from electoral politics to factional politics. And this is, in a way, even more bizarre and intriguing, and nobody knows what to make of it. Putin spent the summer moving out his old KGB buddies, replacing them with often new KGB buddies, but younger and different. And everybody was wondering, was this some kind of purge? What's going on? Suddenly, this week, the focus has turned to ousting liberal technocrats. You had this stunning arrest of the Minister of Economy on charges of taking a bribe. People couldn't figure out exactly what was involved, because he was trying to extort a bribe from Putin's best friend. Huh? Very stupid. It was such a small bribe, people say. What could be the reason for that? But Moscow is vibrating with thoughts that Putin is beginning another purge, or extending his purge from the KGB to his kept liberals. And nobody knows what that means, but they somehow figure it must have to do with preparations for the presidential election. My view is, I'll tell you, that we always overinterpret this as struggle for power, whereas really it's the struggle for stuff. People want property, they want to control big companies, they want vast wealth. And this is another episode in that struggle. Let me stop with this, but say, by way of a pivot to Angela, is there a foreign policy connection here? Putin has got many reasons for a strong internal focus. The value of foreign policy, in some ways, is arguably less than it has been. Putin's big success in Crimea, which some Russian commentators call the Crimean Consensus, is that's the nature of the regime. It's built on this achievement. That was 2 years ago, almost 3 years ago. Now he's got a series of other problems involving the stability of the regime going forward. Syria, what he's doing in Syria is very big, very important, but it's not like Crimea in terms of unifying the country. Last point I'll make, and then I'll stop. In this environment, he may not need foreign policy victories as much as he did in the past, but he can't afford defeats. He has a rather, there's a lot of stress in the system right now for all of his achievements and victories. And people in Russian politics are wondering what'll happen next.
Okay, thank you, Steve. I'm delighted to be here. I just want to add something to what Steve said. So a couple of weeks ago, I was in Russia for the annual conference where they bring in some foreign experts and we meet with senior Russian officials and President Putin. And I have to say, reinforcing what you said, President Putin was really the populist. He stood up there and he said, the elites have failed the people. And of course, he talked about the US and Europe. He didn't talk about Russia. But he kept coming back to this theme that in a new world order, the people are rising up. And as Russia, gets ready to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution next year, they're going to have to play this very delicately because that was the ultimate color revolution of all times, right? Lenin and the others overthrow the corrupt legal,
It was the result of foreign interference.
Foreign interference. Oh, that's right. Forgot
the Germans did it.
The Germans did it.
They were pursuing democracy.
That's right. Anyway, so he certainly is portraying himself like this. And one other funny thing on the economics minister who's now been arrested, as one of the business leaders said, any man who would demand a bribe from Putin's closest buddy, who's very powerful, belongs in a psychiatric hospital, not a prison. But I'm inclined to agree with Steve that it's probably less conspiratorial than you read in the Russian press. So I have an interesting task today. I'm just going to talk about what a Trump administration reset with Russia would look like, and they say something about its implications for our relationship with our European allies. And I want to tell you, I'm not advocating this. I'm describing what I think might happen. So just keep those two things separate. So let's ask, what did Mr. Trump say on the campaign trail about Russia? Well, we know that Vladimir Putin was the one foreign leader whom he consistently praised. He said, this is a man I can do business with. He's a strong leader. And then he said, unlike our own president, and he's done great things. And Mr. Putin returned the compliment, or really, I think he offered the first salvo in this when he praised Mr. Trump last year as, well, it was mistranslated into brilliant in English. But what he said was he was a kind of bright, colorful, interesting personality. And again, at this gathering a couple of weeks ago before the election, he said, this is a very interesting man who has some very important policies that he's interested in. So we know what he said about Mr. Putin himself. He has said there's no reason why Russia and the US should have such a bad relationship. We should be able to work together as two great powers on pressing issues of the day, particularly defeating the Islamic State. Remember when he was asked multiple times about what our government has now said about Russian interference, cyber interference in our own election, he has refused to say that he thinks that's true. He said, well, maybe they did, we don't know enough. And in that first debate, remember, he said it was probably some 400-pound person sitting on their bed, who likes to hack. So he's really rejected everything that he's been told, apparently, in his briefings up till now. And now just on Ukraine for a moment. In September, President Poroshenko, the Ukrainian president, was in New York. Hillary Clinton met with him. Mr. Trump declined to meet with him. And even before that, when the Republicans had their convention, the Trump people campaign had removed from the platform a commitment to supplying the Ukrainian army with defensive lethal weapons. So I think that gives a couple more clues there. So that's sort of more or less what we heard. He also did say during the campaign that he would want to go and meet with Mr. Putin even before inauguration. We know that he's had a telephone call with him. We haven't heard any more about that, and obviously we're not sure what's going to happen going forward. So now we have an incoming Trump administration, and they're looking to improve ties with Russia. Well, hopefully one of the things that they will remember, and I wrote a book on this a couple of years ago called The Limits of Partnership, is that every US president since the Soviet collapse has come in and they've tried to improve ties with Russia. They've tried to find a better way of interacting with the Kremlin. And each of these attempts has ended in failure and disappointment. And that's quite simply because we and the Russians have a very different idea of what a productive relationship would look like. And that's, of course, what we will be facing as we go into the next administration. And I think the second point is that Mr. Putin has made clear on several occasions, particularly in the last year, that his idea of the prerequisites for an improved US-Russian relationship is essentially to return to the Yalta system that existed after World War II. Now, China would clearly be part of this now. We're not in a bipolar world. But where the great powers divide up the world and say, these countries are in this great power sphere of influence, we have our sphere of influence, you do, and these are your legitimate interests. Putin is seeking an American recognition that Russia has a legitimate right to a sphere of influence, at least in the post-Soviet space, maybe if not beyond that. And that's one fundamental tenet. Now, recently, a couple of weeks ago, I guess, Russia withdrew from a plutonium agreement that the US and Russia had signed together. It has to do with the disposition of weapons-grade plutonium. But Russia made clear that there were three conditions under which Russia might rejoin that agreement. Number one, withdrawing NATO troops to the level that they were before 2000, in other words, before NATO enlargement. Secondly, repealing the Magnitsky Act. This is a congressional legislation that imposes visa bans and asset freezes on Russian officials convicted or whom we consider human rights violators. And then the third one is that the US should, of course, repeal all of the economic sanctions, financial sanctions imposed on Russia after the annexation of Crimea and the launching of this war in Ukraine, which, by the way, has killed 10,000 people, and which the International Criminal Court has now said, was Russia's responsibility. Not only should we remove those sanctions, but we should pay Russia compensation for that. So when I was at this gathering a couple of weeks ago, I asked President Putin, I said, these, were conditions. Are these still the conditions? Would this be your starting point for negotiations with the United States? And he just looked at me and said, I see that you're an academic and not a diplomat, which, of course, is true. I'm not going to tell you what our starting position would be. Anyway, if that's the starting position, that would be a rather huge leap. Now, what I think is possible, and again, now I'm coming back to what we've heard from people in Mr. Trump's camp, would be what's the nature of this deal? It would be, first of all, recognizing that Crimea is part of Russia, and he and some of his other people have said that. And it would be also, I think, in some way implicitly recognizing that Ukraine, is of special interest to Russia, and that Ukraine in the future, shouldn't be seeking either European Union or NATO membership, neither of which, of course, is on offer, but that there should be some kind of gentleman's agreement, even if it's not an official agreement, that we recognize that this is much more important to Russia. Now, I should say that if you go back and you read the article in the Atlantic Monthly by Jeffrey Goldberg in April called the Obama Doctrine, President Obama didn't quite say that, but he hinted at that too. He said, Ukraine's much closer to Russia. Russia is militarily predominant there, and we're not going to try and counter Russia there. So that would be part of the deal. So then the question is, what would the United States get from this? We know what Russia would get from this. And that's not clear. Would we demand that Russia, in fact, withdraw from the east and the Donbass region region, as it's supposed to do according to the Minsk agreements that were signed a couple of years ago? Would we ask that Russia cease harassing NATO ships and airplanes, et cetera, in the Baltic Sea? I don't know. I'm just saying, we know that our next president is an experienced businessman, and usually, the art of the deal, you have to get something from the deal too, not just the other side. Then there's the question of Syria. Steve has already mentioned that. So, all right, Mr. Trump has said we have to join with the Russians in defeating Islamic State. There's very little evidence until now that Russia is actually interested in defeating Islamic State. If you look at what they're doing in Aleppo now, and they have taken that, they've intensified the bombing now, even since the phone call between Mr. Trump and Mr. Putin, that Islamic State isn't in Aleppo. So what the Russians are trying to do is much more consolidate President Assad's rule over that part of Syria, the western part, where Russia also has influence, and obviously the Iranians are involved. So presumably part of this bargain would also be the US saying, we recognize that President Assad is going to be in power for the foreseeable future, and we're not going to try and remove him. So I'm just throwing these things out. So that could be part of a grand bargain. What else might there be? I mean, one thing that there should be, and now I am inserting my own views here, in 2021, the New START agreement, the nuclear arms control agreement that was negotiated by the Obama administration, that expires. Once that's expired, and particularly if the agreement on intermediate range nuclear forces is no longer in force, which it may not be, we won't have any arms control regime between the United States and Russia. So it would certainly behoove a Trump administration to think about that quite early on. Of course, it's going to depend who's at the helm, in the State Department, the Defense Department. Then another area where I think we should be talking to the Russians, as we have with the Chinese, is to resume discussions on a cyber agreement, which of course we do have with the Chinese. That's something where you certainly could at least begin negotiations. And I think that the other part of that deal, I believe, and this goes back obviously to what Carl Gershman was talking about, I think would be that the next US administration is not going to be concerned with democracy and human rights promotion in Russia. Obviously, it hasn't gone so well. Many of our NGOs and organizations have been forced to leave, but that certainly would not be part of the plan. All right, so I've really outlined for you what you would call the ultimate kind of realist, realpolitik deal, where you're just talking about interests, where you cede to Russia essentially a sphere of influence, and you work with them, and you don't try and contain them, I don't know what happens then to the agreements that we currently have on Ukraine with them. So finally, what would that mean for our European allies? And obviously, that would be a major, major shift. You know that President Obama is talking with Chancellor Merkel today. Over the past couple of years, the US and Europe, but particularly in Germany, have worked painstakingly out a combined, unified plan really for dealing with Russia in a way that it hasn't been coordinated like that for a long time. And that's involved, obviously, sanctions, and it's involved building up NATO's troop strength nearer the Russian border. Well, Mr. Trump has also said that probably the sanctions should be removed. And if he did discuss with Mr. Putin, as the Kremlin website says they did 2 days ago, increasing economic and trade links, well, that would imply that the sanctions will be lifted. Well, then clearly the European sanctions will be lifted, since there are a number of European countries that are chafing at the bit to have them lifted. So that will mean it'll be back to business as usual with Russia. So that again will mean that this kind of US-European coordination has really broken down. Now, Mr. Trump, of course, has also criticized NATO throughout the campaign. He's questioned the reason, why do we need NATO anymore? Our allies should be paying more. And he's even said we would not invoke Article 5. We wouldn't defend an ally if attacked by an outside power if they don't spend at least 2% of their GDP on defense. So we don't know about the future of NATO. This kind of deal with, paradoxically, the idea of a deal like this with Russia makes the Europeans very nervous, even though at other points, different European countries have worried that the United States' relationship with Russia was so tense that it was bad for Europe. But I think now we're in a state where they wonder what will happen to their security going forward. So we are obviously in uncharted territory. We don't know what the nature of this Trump reset will be. But there's been a pretty consistent commitment to do this. And therefore, I would expect some of this at least to happen. So I will stop there.
Great. Thank you for the invitation. It's an honor to be here. It's tempting for me to start with Turkey and Turkey's relations with the EU and the new Trump administration, but I think it may be a better point to start with what's going on in Turkey first, because compared to Russia, I believe, or compared to many other countries, it became much more difficult to understand Turkish domestic dynamics lately. In the good old days, there was a sense that the army was in charge in Turkey, that we knew basically what was going on during the Cold War. Turkey was a NATO member, it was pro-West. Then Erdogan came to power in 2002, and for a long time, actually up until recently, Turkey was the best hope in the Islamic world in terms of challenging this clash of civilization. Erdogan proved up until relatively recently that there could be a model for the Islamic world in terms of the compatibility of Islam, democracy, and secularism. Turkey was trying to become a member of the European Union. Erdogan was undertaking democratic reforms. Then something went really wrong. And my belief is that in the West, we have a hard time understanding what went wrong really in Turkey, what went wrong with Erdogan, this man who was hailed up until recently as the model for the Islamic world, now has become a kind of evil dictator in the eyes of the West. So I'll spend a little bit time explaining the Turkish domestic dynamics, my take on what went wrong, then talk briefly about Turkey-EU and Turkey-US. So what went wrong in Turkey? I think Erdogan basically, for a long time, challenged the system, challenged the secular establishment and the strong position of the military in Turkey, and he managed to do that masterfully. He really, I think, emasculated, together with his allies in the country, the stronghold of the army over Turkish politics. And in the meantime, Turkey became more democratic, yet it became also less secular, because the army was the bastion of secularism, and as Turkey became more democratic, it also became less secular. And in time, also, there was a sense that this could lead to a kind of liberal democracy where there is total civilian control over the military, where Turkey basically is taking reforms towards the European Union. But instead what happened is that Erdogan replaced, in a way, the old authoritarian tradition of Turkey, and he became, in a way, the oppressor. He became the strong man. Instead of the military as an institution and Kemalism, Atatürk's ideology of secularism, becoming the dominant ideology of Turkey. Today, Erdogan basically became the most important symbol of state power in the country. And in the meantime, something interesting happened. The secularists in Turkey, the army, the Kemalists as we call them, were always a minority, and there was a larger conservative majority in Turkey, represented by Erdogan, also represented by other Islamic groups, but most importantly the Gülen, Fethullah Gülen community, which was also a moderately Islamic movement. And as these more conservative forces basically managed to emasculate the system, the military system, the secular system, you had basically more of a majoritarian rule in Turkey. Today, one can argue that Erdogan represents this kind of majority. And in the past, with the Kemalists, with the military, when the military was in charge, we had somewhat of a tyranny of the minority system. The secularists were able to impose their ideology over conservative masses or over the Kurds, for instance, who were also left out of the system. Today, what we have, I'm trying to simplify a little bit, is no longer this tyranny of the minority under the Kemalist system and military tutelage, but what we have is the tyranny of the majority. And Erdogan, in that sense, became the tyrant, but he has this very strong popular majority. He keeps winning elections in the country, and he is the kind of populist nationalist leader. And that, in a way, that is the main reason why he looks at Trump and he sees, in a way, himself in Trump. He says, this is a man who basically rises against the elites. He's challenging the system. He's representing a kind of anti-systemic alternative. And his reading of American politics and the rise of populism is similar to the way Putin is reading it. But he's very conscious that he represents the kind of populist, nativist, nationalist alternative to this kind of secular elites, the liberal elites, so, if you will. So what went wrong? What changed Erdogan? Because at one point he was a Democrat. Well, I think when there was the military, when there was an institution that was challenging him, he had to be more moderate. There were certain red lines that he had to accept. He managed to, first of all, emasculate the military, especially with the Gülenists, who were well represented. The Gülen community was well represented in the judiciary, in the intelligence. They together, hand in glove, in the good old days when the Gülen group and the AKP worked together, they managed to emasculate, sideline the military. Once the military was sidelined, Erdogan had free rein to do what he wanted. The Gülenists also had, to a certain degree, more power, and a power struggle began between the two, which basically deteriorated, exacerbated domestic dynamics. The Gülenists wanted a more moderate, a more democratic Turkey, and they saw in Erdogan a very dangerous autocrat. So they tried to go after him. Erdogan decided to go against the Gülenists, and so this turned into a kind of Islamic fratricide, two Islamic groups fighting each other. And that was very bad for Turkish political dynamics, because it, instead of bringing more democracy, it brought more polarization and more authoritarianism to the system. The second dimension of what went wrong in Turkey was in foreign policy. With the Arab Spring came the moment of the Muslim Brotherhood in the Middle East. The Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, in Tunisia, in other places started to win elections. And Erdogan comes from the Muslim Brotherhood tradition. He's a reformed Islamist. But in the Muslim Brotherhood, he saw basically something of an opportunity to become the leader of the Muslim world, the leader of the Middle East. And that brought hubris to Turkish foreign policy, a sense that Turkey now is riding this Islamic wave in the Middle East, and Erdogan was no longer confined at home by the military. He also was no longer confined in foreign policy. With the arrival of the Arab Spring, this hubris and this sense that he can change the Middle East and he can become the leader in a kind of neo-Ottoman vision that Turkey could reestablish Islamic prestige, Islamic grandeur. He can become the real leader of the Middle East. That also got somewhat into his head and led to major errors in terms of his blind support for Morsi in Egypt. And when Morsi was toppled by the military, he was really troubled by that. And he expected the West to call what happened in Egypt a military coup, something that both the Obama administration and the EU was unable to do. The fact that the ousting of Morsi was not called a coup created problems in his relations with the West. He was already having problems with the European Union because in the European Union there was a kind of, I would say, populist anger against Turkey. They didn't, leaders like Sarkozy, Merkel did not want a Muslim country in the European Union, so he was already burning bridges with the EU. With Egypt, he was really disappointed with the Obama administration. Then in Syria, he was hoping that somehow the Muslim Brotherhood would rise up and Assad would be toppled quickly, the way Mubarak was toppled, and that did not happen. And Syria turned into a nightmare for Turkish foreign policy. So the Arab Spring, this big hope of leadership in the Muslim world, Arab world, turned into a nightmare for Erdogan, and that, to a certain degree, explains the failure of Turkish foreign policy. There was a time when Erdogan was pursuing zero problems with neighbors. He wanted to have good relations with Iraq, Iran, Syria, Russia, Armenia, every country in the region. Today, the joke is that Turkey has zero neighbors without problems. It has basically all major problems with all the neighbors. So there's a failure in foreign policy, there's a failure in domestic politics. And things went from bad to worse this summer with basically major terrorist attacks in Istanbul. ISIL cells in Turkey are very important. Turkey supported jihadists in Syria with the hope that jihadists will basically topple the regime in Damascus. So Turkey's lax border security with Syria led to major jihadist infiltration to Syria. And Erdogan, in a way, is paying a price for that because now there are major jihadist networks, ISIL networks, that have hit Istanbul, If you remember, shortly before the failed coup attempt, there was a major terrorist attack in Istanbul, which killed more than 50 people at the airport. Turkish tourism was badly hit. In the meantime, the Kurdish problem, which I failed to mention, also turned into a nightmare for Erdogan. The Kurds have become the best allies of the West in fighting ISIL, and the same Kurds that are the best allies of the United States are, in the eyes of Turkey, terrorists, because Turkey labels them as part of the PKK, which is a Kurdish nationalist organization. So all of a sudden, Turkey had started to have problems with the United States in terms of US foreign policy in Syria, which was largely relying on the Kurds fighting ISIL, and the same Kurds in the eyes of Turkey are terrorists. So you had these issues this summer, ISIL terrorist attacks, Kurdish terrorist attacks as well. As if all this was not enough, then we had a failed coup attempt in July, which turned Turkish politics really upside down in terms of giving Erdogan even more legitimacy, power, autocratic legitimacy to purge anyone who is opposed to his power, starting with the Gülenists, the remnants of the Gülenists in the state institutions, also within the military. He labeled the coup as a Gülenist coup, and there were probably Gülenist elements within the army, but it was a much larger coalition, in my opinion, involved of ultra-secularist nationalists. 40% of the generals and admirals have been purged from the Turkish military. I don't think 40% of the Turkish generals or admirals were Gülenists. There were probably strong secularists among them. So he's purging all his opponents, including the Kurds, including the liberal secularists. And he's establishing really a populist, nationalist, proto-fascist system in Turkey. And he keeps winning elections. So that's the big problem. And my conclusion about this elections business in Turkey is that elections may be free in Turkey in the sense that people participate in elections, people vote, turnout is around 85%, and there is an opposition in Turkey. However, they're not really fair. These elections are not fair in Turkey because the opposition does not have access to the media. The media is now totally controlled by Erdogan. He has a propaganda machine which is able to control information. So Turks don't have access to unbiased, objective information anymore. And Erdogan has managed to monopolize information, monopolize basically the newspapers. And therefore, elections are free to a certain degree, but they're not fair. And he keeps winning them. His popularity is very high. He wants to establish a kind of imperial presidency right now to assure that he will maintain his ability to run the country as the president. And the economy, which is the big issue in Turkey in terms of the popularity of Erdogan, overall is doing okay. We haven't really seen a major recession in Turkey. Erdogan has established a kind of clientelistic networks, a little bit like the oligarchs in Russia, but Turkey doesn't have oil. It doesn't have really these natural resources. What it has is basically prime real estate and construction companies. Istanbul is a booming city with 15 million, and construction companies are the main oligarchs of Turkey. They're building everywhere in Turkey, and Erdogan basically gets a cut. There's a kind of soft corruption, patronage, and clientelism, and he manages, through his control of interest rates and the mortgage system and the soft credit, the Turkish economy. Unemployment is not very high, and he's able to provide, Erdogan's party is able to provide economic services, better roads, better hospitals, better schools to Turkish people, to especially lower middle classes, and Erdogan is the darling of the lower middle classes. The lower middle classes get better access now to housing, to healthcare, to infrastructure. Therefore, they love the economic stability and political stability that Erdogan is providing, and he's getting a lot of votes from the periphery, from basically the countryside, from the urban poor, and from the lower middle classes. So that's how he maintains his power in Turkey. And if there's an election tomorrow, he would win with 60-70% and consolidate his presidential regime. Very shortly on what's going on with Europe. Well, in Europe, you have this major refugee crisis now, and most of these refugees are coming from Turkey. And Europe, in that sense, is taken hostage by Turkey's power to hold the refugees in Turkey. And this is why Angela Merkel desperately needs Erdogan's cooperation in order to control the refugee crisis in Germany. Because if Germany or France but especially Germany says, we will shut the door to Europe to negotiations with you, Erdogan can say, oh, really? Okay, then you can get 1 million refugees to the Greek islands, to the Balkans, and to Germany, which would turn into a major crisis for Europe. So in a way, Erdogan has geostrategic leverage with the European Union, and he's turning it into, I think, to a certain degree, cash. He wants to get more money, although he's unable to get more money from the EU because the EU has certain conditions from Turkey. But the climate, the atmospherics of Turkey-EU relations are really bad. In the meantime, the EU press is portraying Erdogan as a dangerous Islamist autocrat, and therefore he's very resentful against the EU. And Erdogan, deep down, is a nationalist, and I think he's ready to burn the bridges with the EU. He's ready to call a referendum and says it quits. We're not interested in the EU anymore, which is, I think, creating panic in the EU, because if Turkey basically ends these partnerships, that means it could open the border and flood Europe with refugees. So that's the nightmare, in my opinion, for politicians in Europe. And Erdogan can also bring, in a way, anti-Islamic, right-wing, xenophobic political parties like Front National to power in France. Why? Because he would basically create a major refugee crisis, and this right-wing nationalism, xenophobic, Islamophobic parties can capitalize on Erdogan's policies. So he has a lot of leverage, in my opinion, with the EU at a time when the EU does not have much leverage with Turkey, because no one really seriously believes that Turkey will become a member of the European Union. And Brexit has kind of worsened the dynamics, because Britain was a strong supporter of Turkey in the European Union. Now Britain is out. So my only hope in terms of the future of transatlantic partnership, in terms of Turkey-EU relations, is that maybe one day, in the best scenario, if there's a privileged partnership between the EU and Britain, that could become a model for Turkey-EU relations. Turkey can say, we want what Britain has, a kind of privileged partnership. We're not interested in full membership anymore. At least that could be an anchor for Turkey in a way to link itself to the European Union. But even that is a far bridge right now. I'm more pessimistic in terms of Turkey-EU relations than what I will conclude with now with Turkey-US relations. Why am I more optimistic about Turkey-US relations? Because it's not because of really benign reasons. In a way, it's more because Erdogan and Trump, in my opinion, will have an excellent relationship. First of all, temperamentally, they will get along just fine. They both hate the media. They both are populist nativists. They both have disdain for the elites. And they both believe in a transactional partnership. So Trump will probably look at Erdogan as a strong leader. He already calls him a strong leader, a little bit like the way he looks at Putin. And Erdogan is delighted in the electoral victory of Trump, mainly because he believed that Hillary Clinton would continue to support the Kurds or be perhaps tough on Turkish democracy, human rights, and whereas Trump could not care less about authoritarianism in Turkey. He doesn't care about human rights issues. He will basically cut a deal, in my opinion, with Erdogan on a number of issues, including potentially the extradition of Fethullah Gülen. His national security advisor, probably Michael Flint, who I think will become the national security advisor, has written an op-ed saying that the United States should extradite Fethullah Gülen. That came to the delight of the Erdogan crowd in Turkey. The media delighted in that news, because finally someone who understands the real threat of Fethullah Gülen who can extradite it. Of course, there's a small problem of rule of law in the United States. You cannot extradite someone just because you want to extradite him. He holds a green card. Therefore, there has to be a situation where Trump trumps the rule of law. And I'm not sure he can trump the rule of law, but he'll probably try. But he can make the life of the Gülenists in this country miserable by launching more FBI investigations, by trying to shut down the schools that the Gülen community has. So that's good news for Erdogan. It's also good news for him that perhaps Trump can cut a deal with Putin. And he may decide that with Putin and Assad, they will join together and try to fight ISIL much more effectively, perhaps by providing even more American military support on the ground. So ISIL is the real enemy. Putin, I think Trump believes, wants to fight ISIL. And he supports Assad. And I think Trump would have no problem with Assad staying in power. And Turkey can calibrate its position to that. Turkey can calibrate its position towards a new Syria dynamic where Assad stays in power, Trump, the United States and Russia work together against ISIL, as long as the United States no longer supports the Kurds. Because that's the main concern, strategic priority of Erdogan. He wants basically Trump to dump the Kurds and to say, I will work with you, Erdogan, Turkey. Please send some troops to northern Syria. We can even maybe talk about a no-fly zone where your construction companies and my construction companies can work together and build basically housing for the refugees. I could see easily that happening in their transactional partnership. And that could be the new partnership between Trump and Erdogan, trying to work together against ISIL in Syria. And Erdogan will basically position himself with Assad staying in power as long as the Kurds are sidelined, as long as Trump no longer relies on the Kurds to fight ISIL. So that could be the best scenario in terms of what Erdogan is hoping from Trump.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank our panelists for their in-depth presentations. As you can see, they touched on many of the challenges. Populism, as seen in the Brexit vote, migration, in terms of terrorism, as well as the national interests of the respective countries they address. We have time for a few questions, but I'd like to start the questioning with a question from myself here. For decades, the foundation of transatlantic security has been NATO. NATO was meant to keep the United States in Europe and to keep the Russians out. The question is this still a relevant basis for security? And if so, why? If not, why not? And what would you recommend to President-elect Trump, depending on your perspective of the NATO situation? Anybody want to go first?
Sure. Look, President Trump can say that he respects NATO, and he's told President Obama this, and President Obama has gone to Europe saying, yes, complete respect for NATO. But the problem with that is that the big challenges that NATO faces right now are in the realm just beyond it. If NATO decides to reaffirm Article 5, but throws Ukraine over the side, it will be in the way that Angela has described, I think, a major defeat for the alliance. It will feel as though they will tell themselves, we are strengthening our mutual solidarity, but they will have given Putin the kind of victory that will actually weaken the alliance. And the same thing is true with Turkey. You can say, well, we're going to strengthen our alliance relationship with Turkey, but what Ömer has described is a kind of breakdown, really, of coordination within the whole alliance, because it involves telling the Europeans, we are actually going to impose a solution on you which is not, and we're not going to come to a decision about that in the way that we typically have. So my sense is there's a cheap way of affirming the value of NATO that can actually involve serious setbacks for it. How's that for an alarmist?
Yeah. And can I just say, I mean, so the problem that Mr. Trump was talking about is one that, Bob Gates talked about, other people have talked. I mean, we the United States, a disproportionate burden for ensuring that Europe is whole, safe, and secure. And at some point, when there are economic difficulties, and he's just won an election promising the American people that he'll focus more on their own economic needs, it becomes increasingly difficult to justify continuing this kind of structure where where only a few of the members of NATO actually pay 2% of their GDP, spend it on defense. So I think if there isn't a resolution of this, then I think going forward, I would agree with Steve. This is not going to be an alliance that's going to look in very good shape in the next 4 years.
One sentence addition to that on spending.
Yeah.
The United States has cut its presence and spending on Europe massively in the past 25 years. Trump never talks about that.
Right, he doesn't.
The kinds of cuts that the Europeans have made exactly mirror the withdrawn American presence.
On Turkey, I think Turkey is becoming increasingly nationalist. You don't have really this big risk of an Islamization in Turkey, in my opinion, but the real risk of Turkey is this anger against the United States, but also against Europe mainly, which will, I think, translate into a much more populist, nationalist sentiment. In other words, if you really want to understand Erdogan, don't look at a Islamist leader like Morsi or definitely not Khomeini, etc. Think of Charles de Gaulle. Think of France basically leaving the military wing of NATO. Why did Charles de Gaulle in the 60s left NATO? Because he wanted French grandeur, he wanted French independence, a French nuclear force, a force de frappe. And Erdogan really wants all this. He wants Turkish independence, sovereignty, an ability to cut deals with Russia, with China, with India, with the rising powers in the East, and he doesn't want to put all the Turkish eggs into the NATO basket. So Trump will have to come to him, America will have to come to Erdogan if they really want to keep him in the NATO camp with a lot of goodies. And these goodies will have to involve military partnership programs, military exchange, Patriot missiles, technology sharing. Otherwise, what you have in Turkey is a very Eurasianist mood, a Eurasianist mood which wants Turkey to have better relations with the East rather than commitment to NATO and the Transatlantic Partnership. Just recently, Turkey has canceled, for instance, where I teach at the National Defense University, military education programs of Turkish officers. So there's a new wave in the Turkish army also. Most of the officers who have been purged are NATO-trained officers. The rising class in the Turkish army are officers who have more of a nationalist, Eurasianist pedigree.
Okay, thank you. We have time for one question because we're running behind schedule here. Anyone with a question? Jim?
Professor Taşpinar.
Sorry, if you could just wait one moment for the microphone. Thank you.
For Professor Taşpinar, if there is a withdrawal from the Iranian protocol, an agreement with Europeans, would the logic of the current Turkish administration be to secure a nuclear weapon?
Yes, I think if Trump's policy on Russia is positive for Turkey, rapprochement, Trump's policy on Iran is rather dangerous because Turkey doesn't want really a new sanction regime against Iran. Turkey has good relations with Iran in terms of trade deals, energy dependence. But make no mistake, Iran is also a regional rival. Iran is the Shiite country supporting basically the Shiite rise in the Middle East, whereas Turkey is a Sunni country which has more sympathies for Saudi Arabia and the Sunni establishment in these countries. So Turkey, if Iran becomes nuclear one day, would definitely prefer to have its own nuclear weapon, just like Charles de Gaulle wanted its own nuclear weapon. It will not rely, in my opinion, on NATO for a nuclear umbrella. It's a question of prestige, it's a question of grandeur, it's also a question of sovereignty and independence for Erdogan.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we've run out of time, and that brings this panel to a conclusion. I'd like you to join me in thanking our panelists for their presentation.